via email. And now it is my great pleasure to introduce to you Dr. Joel Best, someone who has greatly influenced my thinking and teaching about data and statistics. Dr. Best, the floor is yours.
Hello, everyone. I'm going to move to my slides if I can figure out where the share screen button is. Here it is. Okay, let's go back and see the glorious title page. Okay, I want to do something that is probably a little atypical for an ICPSR presentation, in that I want to talk about issues that may seem very obvious, and they're so obvious that we don't think about them very much, and sometimes I think that gets us into trouble. So I want to begin with an example, and this is an example of a statistic that has been around for a while. I'm picking a time when someone spoke about this on an episode of All Things Considered, and this was an interview with an architect who was talking about the problem of birds being killed when they fly into windows. And he says in the course of this talk that this happens 1 billion times a year in the United States. And the reporter says, 1 billion, that's really a lot. And he says, oh, this is based on very careful data. So I just like to take a moment to examine the very careful data. Now, there was an earlier estimate for the number of fatal bird strikes on windows. It came from the Fish and Wildlife Service, I think from the 1960s. And someone had asked them how many birds die this way. And someone at the Fish and Wildlife Service said, got the back of an envelope and said, well, figure that there are 3.5 million square miles in the continental United States. Figure 1 bird death per square mile. There must be about 3.5 million birds dying this way each year. In other words, it's a guess, all right? So there's an ornithologist that is bothered by this number, and he thinks it's too low. And he eventually comes up with the following formula. He figures that there are 97 million buildings in the United States that have windows. And this was a number that came from, I don't know, some federal agency point somewhere. And then he says, let's assume that each building has between 1 and 10 bird deaths per year. Okay, that would give us a range of 97 million to 975 million bird deaths per year. And people who are concerned about fatal bird strikes routinely take that number, the big number, and round it up, and they get 1 billion. Now the point is, that's very careful. Hey, that's where the data comes from. And what I want you to do is think about this, because when most of us had a 3rd grade social studies class, we had a unit called Facts and Opinions. And in that unit, we were taught that there are 2 kinds of statements that people think are really true. And one is a fact, which is really, really true. 3 times 3 equals 9, okay? And then there are opinions, and opinions, you may feel it's true, but somebody else might feel something completely different and also feel that was true. So, Superman is the best superhero is an opinion, right? Now, at the end of the unit in 3rd grade, you had a bunch of sentences, and there were words fact and opinion over on the sides, and you were supposed to circle whether this sentence was a fact or an opinion. And of course, what you learn in 3rd grade, what becomes very obvious is, if the sentence has a number in it, it's a fact, okay? And we tend to grant facticity to numbers. That is, we tend to assume that they're real. All right, and I use the analogy. It's like a rock. It's like a nugget that a rock collector could pick up. The number's out there someplace. We speak about discovering numbers. Okay, but a better way to think about it is to think in terms of numbers as being like jewels. Okay, now the lump on the left here is a raw diamond, And it's looking pretty good because you know, when you take this out of the dirt, it's all covered with filth and you have to wash it off and everything. And when you're done, you get something like this, which is still not anything you want to put on your loved one's finger. And of course, on the right, we see a completed diamond. And what I want you to think of is the work that goes into producing a diamond. Okay, you know, somebody has to dig up the rock. Somebody's going to have to cut it. Somebody's going to have to polish it. After it's polished, it's going to be set in a setting so that you view it from a particular angle. It's a jewel at that point. All right, and I want to suggest to you that statistics are like jewels. They are produced through a social process, and sociologists would call this social construction. Now, I realize that's a scare word for some of you, and you've been told that social construction means arbitrary or bogus or something like that. That isn't what sociologists mean by it at all. What they simply mean is there's a social process that is required to produce knowledge. Okay, so you can imagine something like the uniform crime reports, which are produced by the FBI. And there's a process here where local police departments fill out monthly questionnaires about the number of crimes within their jurisdiction. And then these eventually flow to you know, some place that the FBI controls, I assume near Washington, where there are elves that are working, assembling these various reports, pulling them together and assembling them into documents that, you know, have pages and pages of tables, each with lots of columns, each with lots of figures that we think of as factual. But what those crime rates are depend upon all of that social work. Crime rates are socially constructed. Okay, so if you think about it, anyone who's done any research knows this, okay? When you do research, you are invariably making choices. You're making decisions. You're deciding what you're going to do. And so we can ask questions when we see a number like, who counted? Why did they count? Why did they count it? Okay, how did they go about counting it? Okay, where did they do this? And so on and so forth. And all statistics are inevitably shaped by the answers to these questions. Statistics aren't simply out there in nature so that you can pick them up. They are produced by people who are going through a series of steps to try and make sense of the world. Okay, so what I want to do today is talk about COVID-19 statistics, because this has become a big issue in the last, whatever it is, 8 months or so, all right? And I want you to think about early days in this process. Go back, way back in time to February and even the first part of March. And if you're going to produce COVID-19 statistics, the process looks something like this. In this diagram, everybody that's on this page is infected, okay? There are people out there who happily are not infected, but once you get infected, you enter this diagram. And we'll start at the top. Some people are infected, and they're asymptomatic. They're still apparently able to spread the disease, but they don't even feel sick, right? Then there are people who feel sick, and the largest proportion of them stay home, okay? They feel lousy, they do what they do. When they feel lousy, they stay home. If they feel real lousy, some of them go and see a doctor. And most of the time, the doctor is going to say, go home. All right, you can eat all the Advil you want, you can slurp chicken soup, you know, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. Let me know if you really have trouble breathing. And if you really have trouble breathing, then you get hospitalized, right? And so we can imagine somebody in first week in February showing up in a hospital, and they're having a lot of trouble breathing. Now, they may never have been diagnosed with COVID-19. You know, hospitals have people come in all the time who have trouble breathing, and they may have been treated, they've been diagnosed as having some sort of different ailment, and they may have been treated differently. But some people back in the day started being diagnosed with COVID-19. And of course, some of those people live and some people die. All right. Now, I have in red the diagnosed and the dead boxes. And the reason I have those is those are the key statistics that we started getting in February and early March. Okay. They are the number of cases and the number of deaths. Now, initially, when people were dealing with this new epidemic, cases were the number of people who were diagnosed almost always when they were admitted to a hospital. Okay? And so what you can see, if we flip back here for a second, is everybody on this graph is actually a case of COVID-19. But only the people down there in the diagnosed, red diagnosed category are counted as cases. All right. You know, if you're going to be undercounting people by vast margins, because the great majority of people who get sick are never going to wind up in a hospital, be sick enough to wind up in a hospital and get the diagnosis, right? So the number of cases is always an undercount, okay? And in order to solve this problem, what you'd have to do is institute some sort of widespread systematic testing program to figure out how many cases there were out there in the real world. And of course, you know, that did not happen in a speedy way last winter. And in fact, it still is a pretty shaky operation. Deaths are very much the same thing. Notice again, if we go back here, you know, there are people who are going to die. You know, they stayed home and they get sick and they die. They never go to the hospital. Maybe they're in a patient in a nursing home, and you know, we're counting our deaths or our diagnoses originally in hospitals. So there are all kinds of people on the right-hand side of this diagram who may die who aren't going to get counted. Now, it is also possible to overcount deaths, all right? And the way that you do this is that a lot of the people who die from COVID-19 have a lot of comorbidity. They're severely obese. They may have, lots of them are, for example, in nursing homes. They may have 6 or 7 things wrong with them in the nursing home. And, you know, everybody knows these people are going to die at some point. And, you know, they get sick with COVID-19, and COVID-19 may push them over the edge. And, you know, pathologists can get into an argument about whether, you know, this particular case was actually someone who died from COVID-19 or they simply died with COVID-19. All right. So there's nothing very precise about these numbers, and yet they're the numbers that we have. If you open up the the Washington Post or the New York Times, every morning you get these little graphics, okay? And, you know, the Post is very interested in cases per capita. The Times gives us the number of new cases and the number of new deaths and tells us how this has changed over the last 14 days, okay? And you know, this is, you know, it makes sense to us intuitively, you know, how many people are sick, how many people are dying, and we treat these figures as though they are meaningful. But they are, of course, products of a lot of decisions that people have made. Now, think about when we see statistics, and this could be crime rates. It's certainly when we see these statistics on the number of COVID-19 cases or the number of COVID-19 deaths or whatever, we imagine that they're being collected accurately, that there's somebody who's got some impartial system for counting cases and deaths. They're doing it thoroughly. They're looking all around to find all the cases and deaths they can find. And, you know, then they're presenting this data, you know, they're making it public. And you know, theoretically, we should know how all this is done. People should be willing to explain to us how you decide if someone's dying from COVID-19 or with COVID-19. They should explain to us what they counted as a case. And ideally, these measurements would be consistent over time so that you can measure trends. Now, of course, if we go back to early February, they're not going to be consistent over time because in early February, things were in chaos. People weren't necessarily attuned to COVID-19, so they were undercounting like mad. And now we're trying to test. We're catching much more of the actual cases. We're probably doing a better job, but it's when we try and compare those early measurements to later measurements, we're going to find that we're comparing apples to avalanches or something. And similarly, measurements ideally should be the same across space. When we see those little graphs in the Washington Post that say how many cases are there in Wisconsin, how many cases are there in North Dakota, and so on and so forth, we want to think that these things are being measured the same way. But in fact, because we have a federal system, rules about assigning particularly deaths, causes of deaths vary slightly among the states. So it's hard to get accurate measurements. Now, in theory, you might think that the math behind an epidemic is pretty simple, and it looks simple. I mean, this is it, okay? You take the susceptible population, okay, times the infection rate, times the fatality rate, and you get the number of deaths, right? And, you can manipulate this in various ways if you want to focus on some other outcome. But, as we've already said, the infection rate is pretty tricky because the infection rate is going to be the number of cases divided by the population, and the fatality rate is going to be the number of deaths divided by the population. And we already know that neither the number of cases nor the number of deaths are completely accurate, and they were really not accurate early on. Okay, now we've gotten better. Okay, here is this is a nice website, the COVID Tracking Project, and they have these really wonderful graphs. This is a graph for daily cases in the United States, and I got a new version of this a few days ago. And you can see an overall pattern there. What I want you to notice, though, is the sawtooth nature of this graph. That is, if you look carefully, you will see that there are 5 days when there are a lot of cases, 2 days when there aren't very many, 5 days when there are a lot of cases, followed by 2 days when there aren't very many, and so on and so forth. And of course, this is weekends. Okay, people are not going to be working weekends, and so the data is they're going to be people that are diagnosed. Maybe they're diagnosing fewer people on the weekends, and maybe some of the diagnoses don't actually get reported and recorded until later. Here, same thing with deaths. See, you've heard that death takes a holiday. Death takes a weekend off. And you can, presumably people actually are dying. If you look, why Monday tends to have a lot of deaths, which is presumably the Saturday and Sunday deaths getting recorded. Here's tests. It's the same deal. Okay, we are testing, by the way, a lot more people. We are not yet at 1 million tests a day, but we're approaching that level, and you can see that. Even here, we have to smooth out the lines because the process of actually recording these numbers is shaped by things like, what's the work schedule of people who are producing these statistics. Okay, now let's go back again. At the beginning of the epidemic, there was a great deal of uncertainty. Okay, and people weren't sure just how serious this was. And they weren't sure how many people might become sick or even how many people might die. And if you go back to February, you can find people, talking heads on television and so on, who are saying that this is not a big deal, that, the total number of deaths is going to be in 3 figures, or maybe 4 figures, or maybe 5 figures. Okay, and we're of course up in the 6-figure zone now and going. And it's also worth remembering that this is not our first epidemic. This is not our first 21st century epidemic. If you think about it, there have been a number of different epidemics which have received a lot of attention. And two of them received really a lot of attention. Many of you will remember the hysteria around Ebola 6 years ago. An even more interesting case is the H1N1 bird flu epidemic from 2005. Now, you know, this was a wonderful example because the epidemic started in Southeast Asia, and you know, they were discovering that about half the people who got hospitalized were dying. Okay, which people translated into half the people who get sick are going to die. Holy cow, this is going to be a big deal. And so there were talking heads on television for this epidemic that were estimating that the global death toll might reach 1 billion. And I went out and bought a bunch of these books. You know, my favorite one has practical pre-pandemic preparations for individuals. And number one was get your will in order. Okay. And the total global death toll from this was, I think, in the neighborhood of 1,000. Okay. So we were orders of magnitude off in terms of how serious this was going to be. Now, the problem is that COVID-19 became a political issue, and that meant COVID-19 statistics were going to become a political issue. We live in a period when American politics is extremely partisan. You have a president who has a very enthusiastic base of support, but at the same time, a majority of the population has unfavorable views of his performance. Okay, and he was going to be running for re-election, and he was planning to base his campaign on the booming economy. And the economy was in some measures doing quite well. February, the unemployment rate was the lowest it had been in half a century. Okay, so, you know, what is the problem here? Well, the problem is that when you start having significant preventive public health measures, that is, closing things, you know, that's going to markedly slow the economy. So here's an observation that we can make as sociologists make all the time. Whenever some sort of measure becomes consequential, when, you know, this is somehow measuring your performance, we can expect that people will try and monkey with those numbers. Okay? Maybe you can't fix the problem, but you might be able to fix the statistics. And there are lots of examples of this. You know, during the Vietnam War, the Pentagon was eager to demonstrate that the war was going very well. And they instituted body counts as the measure. I mean, it was a confusing war. You couldn't just look at a map and see how much territory you controlled or something like that. So the body count became a kind of measure, and body counts quickly became wildly inflated. And there were also estimates of enemy troop strength, and those were deflated. You know, the people who produced those estimates were continually told to make them smaller. In the case of the No Child Left Behind Act and other standardized tests, if you start telling school districts, principals, and teachers that they are going to be evaluated and there are going to be consequences to those evaluations based on student test scores, there are going to be all sorts of opportunities to try and improve the test scores in your school. Okay, and there's just an extraordinary array of these things. Atlanta got a lot of press, but other places did too. In the case of police departments get criticized if the crime rate is too high, and for decades now, there will periodically be scandals where some police department, often a major police department, New York, Philadelphia, will try and juke the statistics to, report less crime to the FBI, so that their study seems to have a lower crime rate. All right. So this is a very standard kind of practice. If you're being measured by a number, you try and shape the number. All right. So go back to last spring again. Okay. There's a lot of confusion. The president is downplaying the threat in various ways. Okay. And when this is getting started, the number of cases is tiny. Okay, the number of deaths is tiny. They're in one or two figures, and people are saying, well, why are we getting all excited about something like this? It's just not that big a deal. Okay, and there are claims that the death toll is going to be under 1,000. That this is, COVID-19 is just the common cold. And there were people who were saying it's limited to coastal cities, or that we tolerate thousands, tens of thousands of deaths from flu each year, from traffic fatalities. How is this any different? This is kind of a guilty pleasure. Dr. Phil was on Fox News, and he pointed out that each year 360,000 Americans die in swimming pools, which it's about 100 times more than the actual figure. In fact, it's about 200 times more than the actual figure. And so people had a stake in looking to this, and there's starting to be political lines being drawn. Okay, partisanship is leading to skepticism, and these things both make it more difficult to establish policies for prevention and reaction. Okay, and there were other complications as well. The country was very slow to address shortages in resources, key resources, ventilators, protective equipment, and so on. The states took very different approaches to this. Governors were often key figures, and there were governors who were quick to institute preventive measures, and others who were much slower. And there was and still is to some degree a failure to establish an effective testing regimen. Okay. And there are other complications as well. My son has been involved in coordinating data collection on COVID-19 for the state of Delaware. Now, Delaware is a tiny place. There are only 20-some hospitals in Delaware. And, he last spring, he was making calls to hospitals, and he discovered the hospitals were reluctant to share information. And they were reluctant to share information because they think of themselves as in competition with one another. And, this wasn't a big fight, but it took a while to get everybody online. So there's all kinds of problems. Okay. Now, by mid-March, things start to look very different. Okay. Schools and businesses are closing. We initially were told to wash our hands. Now we're told to socially distant. In the week of March 21, there were more than 3 million new unemployment claims. That was a huge shock and a big news story. The number of weekly deaths jumped 10 times, 500, more than 500. Okay. And if you started looking at the news during this period, it was all COVID all the time. Oh, this is becoming the dominant story. Okay. So think a little bit about how we model diseases and try and control them. Okay. There are uncertainties about the data. How good are the data we're working with? There are uncertainties about policies. Okay, at various times, people have produced fairly cheery models that assume that everybody was going to social distance in a very aggressive way, and they didn't. And there are also uncertainties about, after you establish the policies, how much can we count on people to behave well You know, are they going to actually wear masks? Are they going to stand apart, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera? And, you know, all of these things make modeling, you're kind of guessing what's going to happen. Now, if you think about it, here's how the public health people view this. You should have lots of testing. If the testing shows and you're testing, you know, you're not testing people who are admitted to the hospital. You're testing in the general population. And you're particularly testing groups that you know, are at high risk and so on and so forth. All right. If the tests show relatively few infections, that has the possibility of easing policy restrictions a little bit. Okay, you can reopen things a little bit. You can let things go. If there are many infections, you tighten restrictions. All right, you know, we need more compliance. Now, in the public health model, restrictions can be eased when testing identifies fewer infections. In other words, testing is seen as absolutely vital in the public health model, and the results of those tests should be used to determine the policy choices that you make. But there's a rival model, and it's a political model. And the political model is, you know, we have two problems. Now in the public health model, what is the problem? The problem is people are getting sick with COVID-19. In the political model, though, the problem is, there's a second problem, and that problem is that these policies have devastating effects. People are out of jobs, okay? The economy slows down, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And so in the political model, they would much prefer that fewer infections are identified through testing, all right? If any time that you have testing reveals lots of infections, that's an obstacle to easing restrictions. And you would prefer that people would approach this in a very different way. You know, we should go back to work and everything will be all right. All right, so we can anticipate the political actors may seek to discourage evidence of infections. Now, I want to say, when I originally proposed this talk, I sort of imagined that I would find examples of sort of incompetent statistics presented by everybody. I'm somebody who you know, when I talk to conservatives, they tell me liberals produce bad statistics. When I talk to liberals, they tell me bad statistics come from conservatives. And I have come to the view that people produce bad statistics. So, you know, I'm not really interested in beating up on the Trump administration. However, the Trump administration are the people who have a stake in this. Okay, they're the ones who particularly, you know, it just as the police have a stake in how high the crime rate is, or the school district has a stake in how well the standardized test scores look. You know, the Trump administration are the people who are really concerned about, you know, reopening the economy and trying to boost the economy. So I'm going to show you some tactics that have been used, and you know, the examples are going to mostly come from Republicans, and that's not because I think Republicans are the root cause of all evil or something like that. It's just they're the ones who have a stake in trying to put the best face on these numbers, try and avoid numbers that are scary. So this is an April 6th meeting of the task force, the coronavirus task force. And the president and the vice president are here, and they're looking at this graph, and it's a fabulous graph. It shows testing in the United States. Okay, and look at that. It's taken off like a rocket ship. And you know what this misses is that when you have a bar graph, the bar graph usually shows you the number of tests for each day. Okay, and the people who made this graph, and then this is okay, the graph is properly labeled, but they have chosen to make this cumulative. Okay, so you know, sort of by definition, each day, presuming that you have some tests each day, the bar is inevitably going to be higher because you're going to add on this day's tests to the previous total from the previous days. And so here's someone who did this in the conversation who shows that the graph that in the red lines are the graph that the president is producing or speaking to, and the blue share of those lines are the new tests performed. And while it was true that there were going on 2 million total tests, there weren't very many tests any given day. Okay, they were mostly toward the end of this period around 1,000 tests per day. So, you know, this is choosing a statistic which is going to make the point that you want to make. A second issue, and we've seen this with the president particularly, is that, you know, he has repeatedly said quite openly that, you know, this isn't the problem is testing. Testing produces these unfavorable numbers, and the headline here, "Testing makes us look bad. Slow the testing down, please," is a more or less direct quote from the Tulsa rally in, I think, June. And he said this on many other occasions as well, and so have various other people. How do you account for the fact that the United States of America accounts for 25% of the world's deaths? Well, we do more testing, okay? And you know, if we just didn't have deaths, we wouldn't have, or didn't have tests, we wouldn't have so many deaths, right? And then there are the more interesting claims, because there is some tiny truth to this, that COVID-19 deaths can be overcounted. And so here's kind of a paranoid tweet that no one is dying from heart attacks and strokes anymore, and people are only dying of coronavirus. I wonder why. So, you know, they're counting other deaths. They're overcounting coronavirus deaths. Now, you can get into an argument here, and this is a graph that makes this point. You know, we tend to talk about causes of death with the categories that we use on the left, okay? You know, people die of heart disease, cancer, stroke, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And activists have argued, well, what would happen if you thought about the actual causes of death? Maybe it's tobacco use, poor diet, physical inactivity, alcohol, okay? You know, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And so we don't obviously put tobacco on the death certificate. We put heart disease on the death certificate. But, you know, there is a choice there. That's a form of social construction. So with COVID-19, you can get this kind of argument. This is from last month. Senator Ernst in Iowa said COVID-19 deaths there may only be 10,000 or less deaths that were actually singularly COVID-19. In other words, the only thing this person had wrong with them was COVID-19, as opposed to being obese or having, you know, heart problems or whatever. And this has been repeated in you know, by various other people who support the administration. Now, folks have looked at this. 538 did a piece, Scientific American did a piece, and there are other pieces out there. And in general, the consensus of the experts is that we're still undercounting more than we're overcounting. But, you know, there could be, you know, in a particular case, there could be an overcount. And so you have to pay attention to this. But people are aware of this problem, and this is unlikely to be the real cause for what's going on, okay? In fact, if you look at the news, you'll find stories that repeatedly point out to different states having problems with undercounts, okay? States, periodically, there'll be a day. There was a big story in, I think it was last May, where New Jersey suddenly added some thousands of deaths to its death toll. And these were people who were in nursing homes. And because they'd been counting deaths in hospitals, they had neglected to include the people in nursing homes. And somebody said, oh, these people died of COVID-19 too, you need to include them. So there are lots and lots of stories. The lower one's from Florida, here's New Jersey, here's Texas, here's California, here's New York, lots and lots of examples of this stuff. Probably, and these are all stories that tend to emphasize undercounting. So there's another issue, and this is just looking at what the states are doing. There's also the question of what is called excess mortality. And in other words, if we have a pretty good idea of how many people die each day, each month, each year, all right? And we can sort of expect that next year it's going to be about what it was this year, plus a little bit, because the population is growing a little bit, all right? So, if you have a lot more deaths than you're expecting to have, this is called excess mortality. And the New York Times ran a story in early August, which said that the true coronavirus death toll in the United States had already exceeded 200,000. And they based this story on the excess mortality. And of course, the actual announcement that we had cleared the milestone of 200,000 didn't occur until the end last week in September. And so you can graph this excess mortality. This is a excess deaths in New York City, and you can see the blue line is kind of your ordinary garden variety death toll for seasonally adjusted and so on. And the red line is the actual recorded deaths in New York City. And what you can see is that up until the middle of March, they're tracking, pretty much the same. And then there's this colossal spike in early April, which is when New York was all over the news, and they brought things back down under control, at least in this graph. Here's someone talking about regional patterns. This graph only goes up to July, and what you can see is lots of cases in the Northeast very early on. The Midwest kicked in shortly after that, and this summer it was deaths in the South and the West that were producing excess mortality. So all these bars on these charts are all excess mortality in different regions. And if you want interested in the national picture, here you have somebody who's tried to do this. And what you can see is that there's a whole lot of blue stuff there, and that blue stuff is excess mortality. We weren't expecting those deaths. We've got them, so they're dying from something, okay? And it's probably since the green stuff, which is all the ordinary garden variety deaths, cancer and heart disease and so on. Probably they haven't stopped dying of cancer and heart disease, okay? But we have a lot of additional deaths on there. And in fact, what you want to look at is the little red X's there. That's actually the actual total. The blue is the diagnoses for COVID-19. And so there's a kind of white area between the blue and the X's. And that is probably, those are excess deaths that aren't attributed to COVID-19. Probably some of them are. So it's very unlikely this is true. Here's a story that interested me last summer. There was the news that hospitals were ordered to direct their case reports, that is, how many cases do you have, send them to a non-CDC database. There was a private company that was going to set up operations in the Health and Human Services building in Washington, D.C. And the claim was that this would be able to reduce reporting lags and produce more timely data. I don't know if that's true or not. I've been, just kind of mentally wondering if when you take the CDC out of the equation, if anyone's monkeying with this data, but there has not been a reporter that's followed this up that I know of that suggests that there's anything wrong here. However, there is lots of evidence of people, of political figures who are challenging or interfering with CDC reporting. And so there have just been, the CDC has made statements, and the administration has demanded that they retract the statements. I mean, this goes back to the scientists, the idea that the scientists are supposed to report things dispassionately, and the administration has continually put its thumb on the scale to try and reduce bad news coming out of the CDC. And so there are lots of stories like this. This was one from the Daily Beast this morning, and you can look at these things and you can anticipate that all of this is a way of trying to keep the CDC under control. And in addition to that, there have also been several cases where the administration has put things on the CDC's website. In other words, they have written the stuff, that had a kind of cheery tone and put it on the website for everyone to see. Okay, and so there are a variety of ways in which you can make figures look more favorable, or at least less unfavorable. And we can find lots of examples of people trying to do this. All right. Now, we also, of course, this is only possible for me to give this talk because the press has been reasonably active in trying to keep track of what's going on and, telling us about these manipulations. But this is something to be concerned about. Okay, same thing. I want to just, give a big picture here for a moment. This is where we are now. This is from last week. Delaware has a COVID-19 website that you can go to. And what I want you to appreciate is the complexity of this. And this is just part of the first page of this website. You can click on all kinds of stuff, and there are multiple pages in there, and so on and so forth. And this is very sophisticated. So on the one hand, you get the map, and the map shows you where COVID-19 cases are concentrated. And interestingly, they're concentrated in southern Delaware, and which is a rural area. It has a great many poultry plants, and the poultry plants have really been a center for COVID-19 infections. And even though Wilmington has which is up in the northern part of the state, is the biggest city and has a lot of urban poverty. It has registered far fewer COVID-19 cases than the rural South. But notice that if you look, you can see that there are confirmed cases, probable cases. How many of these cases have been in nursing homes? We've got information by counties. We've got deaths, including confirmed deaths and probable deaths, and so on and so forth. And this is now the mark. I was talking about in the early days, we were really thrashing around. We now have a lot of information, and we're kind of keeping track of better track of what's going on, and that will help. And the people who are doing this are in an impossible situation. Okay, and it's if it turns out that in retrospect we look back and we say, you guys overestimated the danger, and that led to delaying reopening. People are going to say, yeah, we never should have listened to you guys. You don't know what you're talking about. Okay, if you underestimate the danger and reopen too early, you know, they're going to be criticized for failing to protect us, right? And it's, you know, and so, you know, obviously the solution to this is to get it just right. And how can you hope to get it just right when this is so confusing? You know, just a sobering reminder. You know, this is the New York Times last May when there was the day that they thought that the death toll would hit 100,000, and they just filled the front page of the newspaper with names. And here is Time Magazine doing something like the same thing, showing the arrival of 2,000. They actually, this was printed for the week, I think, before that the total actually hit 200,000, but it's gives you the idea. Okay, let me just say, let me get a small commercial, and then let me conclude. I'm very interested in feedback. If you have other examples, if you think I've missed things or whatever, I really hope that you would write me and let me know. I am working on a version of this paper, which I want to submit to a journal, and I'd welcome any examples. Now, what is the lesson here? The lesson, the big lesson is not, you know, that Republicans lie or something like that. The point that I'm trying to make is that working with statistics is always messy. And when we tend to treat numbers like little fetishized objects, when we tend to act as though they are little nuggets of truth, we miss the complications. And COVID-19 is interesting precisely because it's this terrible problem. You know, there are lots of people whose lives are being wrecked by this problem, and statistics probably could help us, okay, understand this problem, get a handle on its dimensions, and guide us in making good choices. On the other hand, you know, there is also the sense that, you know, some people are going to feel threatened by those statistics, and they are going to be moved to fiddle with them. And notice that this happens not just in this case, but in cases all the time. This is not something that's unique to COVID-19. COVID-19 just makes the topic seem a little more interesting than, you know, looking at fraud surrounding the No Child Left Behind Act or something like that. Okay, thank you. I'm going to stop sharing.
Thank you, Dr. Best. I would encourage anybody who's listening who has a question to please post it in the Q&A box. And while we're waiting for any of those that might come in, I actually have a question, which is sort of where do we go from here? So if we know that numbers are socially constructed, but they have incredible ramifications, where do we go? What's next?
You know, I think that the solution is always to stop pretending that the numbers are perfect. And you know, that's not, you know, the solution is not to throw out the baby with the bathwater. Okay, we need statistics. We live in a big, complicated world, and we need to have numbers to help us talk about it. Now, you know, each of us lives in a tiny corner of a big, complicated world, and we can't possibly know what's going on unless we can get information. And you know, there's so much out there that information is going to almost inevitably be translated into numbers. So my goal is not to say something like, oh, you can prove anything with statistics, or, you know, statistics are worthless or something like that. That's not my point. My point is that, you know, when you're thinking about a statistic, you need to think about the social processes that go into producing them. And it's very easy, you know, anybody who's doing a piece of research knows this when they're doing the research. But when the research is all done and they start talking about it, particularly when other people read the research, it's as though the truth were delivered on stone tablets, you know, and we can bring it down from the mountaintop to share with people. And, you know, there's more squishiness to all of our data than we pretend.
Thank you. One question that came in is actually a two-part question. Do you believe that brazen tampering or interfering with C.D.C. or other important data from this administration will embolden future administrations to do the same to benefit themselves? And the second part of it is, and do you think that ignorance of data and science or tampering with data and science is more dangerous?
That's a challenge. Let me do the first one first. I don't like to give talks where I pick on Republicans, you know, because I think there's a tendency for professors and particularly for sociologists to do that a lot. You know, if you want to do the study of body counts in Vietnam, the fingerprints over that were all Democratic fingerprints. Okay, I mean, you know, the people who are in power, you know, who want to, you know, manipulate data to give the impression that they're doing a good job. Everybody does it, okay? And we need to be aware of it, okay? We need to watch for it. We may need to make sure that they're on the up and up. But, you know, it's, and you know, I don't think that this administration had to embolden anybody. I don't think that these guys are looking back saying, "Oh, look what they did with body counts. We can do it with COVID-19." I think, you know, this is just, you know, there's an opportunity here. Oh, these numbers don't look so good. How can we fix them so they look a little better? And everybody does that. Okay. The question: is it better to be ignorant or what was the alternative to ignorance?
Is it better to be ignorant or to tamper with the data? Which one is more dangerous?
Well, you know, I think they're both dangerous. I'm not sure that I have a, you know, I have a moralometer that tells me, or a riskometer that tells me which is worse. You know, you'd like to think that some data is better than no data, and you know that's probably true. But you know, if the data is really bad, you know, we might have been better off being ignorant. So you know, I think it depends on the case.
Yeah. And this actually leads to another question that was posted in the chat. Are there any numbers or statistics for COVID-19 that you would argue are more resistant to manipulation by the social processes? So any that we could trust more than others?
Well, you know, I think what you learn with this is you'd think that death, you know, is sort of clear cut. You know, you either have a death or you don't. But as I've been trying to suggest, you don't. You know, it's complicated. I think any of these things can be, you know, manipulated. Okay, and you know, think about this gets done all the time. You know, if you're a drug company and you're producing a new drug, you're going to run trials, and you know, there are people who've written whole books about how you know, the various ways in which you can really kind of massage the data until it looks like you have a favorable outcome. Okay, so that the drug will be approved. And you know, I don't know that there's, you know, what you choose to massage, you know, kind of depends, I think, upon what is within your reach and what looks particularly troubling, and so on and so forth. Neil, you're muted. Neil doesn't think he's muted, but he is.
Oh, I am. I'm okay now?
Yeah, you are now.
So couldn't you take the statistics on COVID-19 and argue that while there has been error and while there has been a systematic effort to obfuscate what's going on, that another group of social actors, epidemiologists, statisticians, scientists, have designed procedures to allow the real phenomenon to manifest itself in these counts? And when we look at this as a case study, in fact, we've done reasonably well in tracking COVID-19 and making predictions and responding appropriately.
Yes, I think that's absolutely true. I think that what we've learned is that a lot of protections that we sort of took for granted, that people A, wouldn't monkey with the data, and B, they would be guided by the data. It turns out that those were sort of they now seem to be like very innocent assumptions. That we've fallen short in both of those measures. So yeah, I think that there have obviously been people who've been trying very hard to do the right thing. And again, if you contrast the very early days when we really had no idea what was going on, and we really had a very ineffective way of measuring what was going on, we're doing a whole hell of a lot better now. And we got that ramped up in a relatively short period of time. It hasn't been a year, and we have a pretty good idea. So yeah, there's a glass half full story to be told.
Yep.
One last question. What is your strategy for keeping up with sorting disinformation with nuggets of truth from information?
Oh, what I do is I kind of clip things and put them in a big pile and eventually try to look at them. I don't have a good system of doing this. I mean, we're living with a fire hose of COVID-19 news. I truly, I cannot imagine having the energy to try and really write about this as a thorough history of this episode. I think that what I'm doing is just sort of cherry picking highlights to try and illustrate things. And I have no idea. That's why I asked if people have other examples. I'd really appreciate them, because I sure could miss stuff. You can look at what I had, and you can see things are in my email feed every day, but it's not all the truth that's out there.
Cool. There is one last question, and then we will be about out of time, actually. So based on the data that you've studied and the conclusions you just stated, what would be your plan for reopening America if you were in the president's spot, the governor's spot?
I think my plan would be to listen to the public health people, and we can always second guess them later, but I think that saying we're basing our policy on the best public health information we have available to us now is a better rationale, and we really wish that this would be okay. And I think there's been some wishing. Well, thank you for the opportunity to do this, everyone.
Thank you for being here, and thank you for re-recording this. As we know, the first recording had some tech challenges.
This was better.
This one was much better, much more complete. Dr. Lasky or Paula, do you guys want to say anything before we close out?
I appreciate
like-
the presentation, Joel.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Okay, thank you so much. And everybody, watch for the slides and the recording in your email. Thanks.